stripped of her inheritance and left entirely penniless, a grieving 20-year-old was handed a dead, stony wasteland by her cold-blooded stepmother just to humiliate her. The arrogant widow was certain she had permanently ruined the girl's future, eagerly tossing her out into the cold like a worthless burden. She had no idea the barren dirt she discarded secretly harbored a staggering hidden fortune, and she never suspected this ruined field concealed the exact power the young outcast needed to build an unstoppable empire, crush her stepmother's cruel expectations, and claim a breathtaking legacy the greedy woman could never touch. Stay close as we tell this story, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Sarah's life had been shaped by two very different kinds of hands. First, there were her mother's, slender and pale, hands that were always tending to fragile things. The delicate tea roses that climbed the south wall of their home, the fine needle point in her lap, and Sarah's own hair, which she would brush for a full 10 minutes every night before bed. Elelana Coulter was a woman of gentle temperament and even more gentle health, and she had passed from the world when Sarah was only 9, leaving behind the scent of lavender and a small, exquisitely carved wooden finch that fit perfectly in the palm of a child's hand. Her father, Thomas Coulter, a man whose life was bound up in the solid, weighty world of wool trading, was adrift in his grief. He was a good man, but not a man equipped for the subtleties of raising a daughter alone. And within 2 years, he had remarried. Agnes was a solicitor's widow, a woman whose hands were never idle and never soft. They were hands for balancing ledgers, for inspecting seams, for finding dust on a high shelf, and for pointing out inadequacy in all its forms. She saw the world as a series of assets and liabilities, and Sarah, with her quiet ways and her deep attachment to a past Agnes had no part in, was firmly in the latter column. The other hands that had shaped Sarah belonged to her maternal grandfather, Arthur Mills. He was a tenant farmer on a sprawling estate 20 meters to the west, a man whose entire being seemed to have been carved from the very earth he worked. His hands were thick and calloused, the nails permanently underlined with dark soil, but they moved with a surprising grace, whether he was mending a dry stone wall, coaxing a lamb into the world, or showing Sarah how to judge the texture of soil by rubbing it between her thumb and forefinger. He spoke little, but he taught her much. He taught her the language of the land, that rushes meant poor drainage, that sorrel and bracken spoke of acidic soil, that the curl of a sheep's horn could tell you its age. He showed her how a well-placed ditch could turn a boggy patch into pasture, and how the stones cleared from a field were not waste, but the bones of a future wall or a cottage foundation. "Never curse a stone, Sarah," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "It's just a piece of the world waiting for its proper place." From him, she learned patience, observation, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of practical work. He passed on when she was 16, leaving her with a well-worn hand trowel and a mind filled with his steady, earthy wisdom. It was a knowledge her stepmother neither understood nor valued, dismissing it as the common trade of a common man. For 4 years after his death, Sarah lived in her father's house as a shadow, her presence tolerated but never welcomed until her father's own health began its final slow decline. The solicitor's office was a small, airless room that smelled of old paper, sealing wax, and quiet disappointment. Mr. Davies, a man whose face seemed to be made of the same dry parchment as the documents on his desk, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. Agnes sat opposite Sarah, a sentinel of propriety, in a dress of severe black silk, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not look at Sarah. Her gaze was fixed on the solicitor, her expression one of patient finality. The last will and testament of Thomas Coulter was a straightforward document. The house, the business, the accounts, and all personal effects were left to his beloved wife, Agnes Coulter. Mr. Davies paused, turning a page with a rustle that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. "And to my daughter, Sarah Eleanor Coulter," he read, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I bequeath the parcel of land situated in the parish of Fenwick, known as Coulter's Folly, consisting of 4.5 acres, to be hers in perpetuity." He slid a folded deed across the polished mahogany. The document was crisp and new, the ink a stark, unforgiving black. Sarah looked at it, then at her stepmother. For the first time, Agnes met her eyes, and in their cool grey depths, Sarah saw not malice, but a kind of dismissive triumph. The field was worthless. It had been in the Coulter family for generations, a piece of notoriously poor ground that no one had ever managed to farm successfully. Giving it to Sarah was a way of fulfilling the letter of the will while violating its spirit entirely. A final clean severance. "Your father wished you to have something of the family's history," Agnes said, her voice smooth and even. "The deed is legally transferred. You will find your trunk packed and waiting by the service entrance. You have until 6:00 this evening to be gone from the house." There was no room for argument, no space for an appeal. It was an administrative act as cold and final as a line drawn at the bottom of a ledger. Sarah stood, her movements calm and deliberate. She took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in the pocket of her worn wool coat. She did not say thank you, and she did not say goodbye. She simply inclined her head slightly to Mr. Davies and walked out of the room, her back straight, leaving the smell of sealed wax and the silent, satisfied presence of her stepmother behind her. She collected her small trunk, which contained 2 changes of clothes, a small book of her mother's pressed flowers, her grandfather's tell, and wrapped in a linen handkerchief, the little wooden finch. With her 7 shillings held tight in her hand, she walked away from the only home she had ever known, without a single backward glance. The journey north was a study in shades of grey. The sky was a low, bruised ceiling of cloud that wept a fine, persistent drizzle, and the coach wheels hissed on the wet road, throwing up arcs of muddy water. Sarah sat wedged between a stout farmer who smelled of damp wool and pipe tobacco, and a young woman with a fretful baby. The rhythmic rocking of the coach, a grim counterpoint to the turmoil in her heart. She watched the familiar, gentle landscape of her childhood give way to the starker beauty of the north. The fields grew larger, bounded not by hedgerows, but by imposing dry stone walls that snaked over the rolling fells like the fossilized spines of ancient beasts. The trees grew sparser, bent, and shaped by a wind that seemed to blow from the beginning of time. It was a landscape that offered no comfort, only a kind of hard, unyielding reality that matched her own circumstances. She did not weep. The lessons of her grandfather had taken root deep within her. Sentiment was a luxury, but observation was a tool for survival. She noted the quality of the livestock, the state of the cottage roofs, the way the smoke from the chimneys was whipped sideways by the wind. She was no longer a daughter in her father's house. She was a solitary woman with a deed to a piece of useless land, and she needed to understand the world she was entering. The coach left her in Fenwick, a village clustered around a small stone church and a single muddy lane. It was a place of work. The air was sharp with the smell of coal smoke and wet earth. Men with grimed faces and heavy boots walked with the stoop of those who spent their days bent to a task, and the women who passed her had the same look of quiet endurance she felt in her own bones. No one paid her any mind. She was just another traveller passing through. After buying a loaf of bread and a small piece of cheese with one of her precious shillings, she asked for directions to the low ground. The baker pointed with a floury thumb. Down the lane, past the old quarry. Can't miss it. Nothing else down there. The lane quickly dissolved into a rooted track, the mud clinging to her boots and pulling at her with every step. The drizzle intensified, soaking through the shoulders of her coat. Finally, the track opened out, and she saw it. Before her lay a sweep of rough, unpromising land, sloping gently down towards a sluggish stream. It was Coulter's Folly. It was exactly as worthless as its reputation suggested. The field was a tapestry of everything a farmer least wants to see. Great patches of bracken and thorny gorse fought for space with tough, wiry grasses that grew in tussocks, a sure sign of acidic, nutrient-poor soil. Rushes clustered in the lowest-lying areas near the stream, indicating the ground was waterlogged for much of the year. And everywhere there were stones, not the small, manageable pebbles of a fertile river valley, but angular, heavy chunks of sandstone and limestone that littered the surface, and she knew would be even more densely packed just beneath the thin layer of topsoil. It was a field that broke ploughs and broke hearts. Her stepmother had chosen her parting gift well. It was a sentence of hard, fruitless labor. Sarah walked the perimeter, her boots sinking into the soft ground, the wet wind whipping strands of hair across her face. She felt the full weight of her situation pressed down on her, a physical ache in her chest. This was her inheritance. This was her home. She sat on a large moss-covered rock, the cold seeping through her skirts, and unwrapped her bread and cheese. As she ate, her gaze roamed over the land, but it was not the gaze of a despairing heiress. It was the careful, assessing eye of Arthur Mills's granddaughter. She saw the slope of the land, calculating the natural lines of drainage. She saw the different types of stone, recognizing the hard-wearing sandstone that was good for building, and the softer limestone that, when burned and slaked, would sweeten the sour soil. She saw problems, yes, 100 of them. But for every problem, her grandfather's voice was in her ear, suggesting a solution. A ditch here, a retaining wall there, a lime kiln built against that outcrop. It would take years. It would take a lifetime. But it was not impossible. As the weak afternoon light began to fade, she walked to the northern corner of the field, the highest point, which offered a small measure of shelter from the prevailing wind. And there she saw it. It was a single large slab of grey limestone, roughly 6 foot long and 40 wide. What was strange was its position. It was almost perfectly flat, and it lay flush with the surface of the ground. While all the other stones around it were jumbled and tilted, it was also of a different type of stone than the local sandstone. It looked deliberate. It looked, she thought, with a sudden, illogical certainty, like a door. She knelt, the damp earth soaking the knees of her dress, and ran her hand over its surface. It was cold and solid, a silent, unmoving fact in a field of chaos. In her pocket, her fingers found the folded deed. This land was hers. The stones, the gorse, the sour soil, and this one strange flat stone. It was all she had in the world. For 2 days, Sarah lived a temporary existence, finding shelter at night in a small, dry hollow beneath an overhanging rock formation at the edge of the old quarry. She spent her daylight hours on the field, not working, but watching. She watched the way the sun, when it briefly appeared, moved across the land, noting which areas received the most light. She watched the pattern of the rain as it fell, seeing how the water pooled and where it ran, confirming her initial assessment of the drainage. She was forming a deep and intimate knowledge of her inheritance, learning its flaws and its hidden possibilities. Her attention kept returning to the large limestone slab. It drew her eye, an anomaly that begged for investigation. On the 3rd morning, the sky was clear, a pale, washed-out blue, and she knew it was time. She took her grandfather's tell from her trunk. Its wooden handle, worn smooth by his grip, felt solid and reassuring in her hand. She began at the edges of the slab, using the pointed tip of the trowel to scrape away the earth and moss that had accumulated over decades. The work was slow and arduous. The soil was compacted and laced with a thick mat of roots. But as she worked, she uncovered a distinct, clean edge, a straight line where the stone met the earth that was too perfect to be natural. It was dressed stone, shaped by a mason's chisel. It took her the better part of the morning to clear all 4 sides. What she revealed was not just a slab, but the capstone of a carefully constructed stone frame set into the ground. There was no handle, no ring, no obvious way to lift it. She tried to find purchase with her fingers, but the fit was too tight. She needed a lever. She found a stout branch of fallen ash, thick as her wrist, and wedged one end into the narrow gap she had cleared. She put all her weight on the other end, her muscles straining. The wood groaned, but the stone did not move. She tried again, shifting her position, using a smaller rock as a fulcrum. This time, with a great grating screech of stone on stone, the slab shifted an inch. It was enough. A sliver of blackness appeared, and from it rose a puff of air, impossibly dry, and smelling of dust and deep, cold stillness. Heartened, she worked the lever back and forth, slowly, patiently, widening the gap until she could slide the great stone sideways, revealing a set of steep, narrow steps leading down into the dark. She peered in, but could see nothing. She needed a light. She walked the 2 miles back to the village, her mind racing. She spent another of her shillings on a small tin lantern and a bottle of oil. The shopkeeper gave her a curious look, but asked no questions. Back at the field, her hands trembling slightly, she lit the lantern. The small flame cast a warm, flickering glow. Holding it aloft, she descended the steps. There were 10 of them, each one a single solid block of stone, expertly laid. They opened into a small, dry chamber, no more than 10 foot square. The walls, floor, and ceiling were lined with the same masterfully fitted stone. It was a vault. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak chest bound with iron straps. It was not locked. With a deep breath, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were canvas bags, dozens of them, heavy with the unmistakable weight and clink of coins. Beneath them were a set of old but beautifully maintained agricultural tools. A hand plough, a bill hook, a scythe, their steel coated in a protective layer of grease, their wooden handles oothen dark with age. And on the very top, resting in a small sealed tin box, was a letter. The paper was thick and yellowed. The ink faded to a rusty brown, but the handwriting was clear and strong. It was dated 1746. To whomever finds this place, it began. My name is Jacob Coulter. This land is mine, and I have built this cellar with my own hands to keep my family safe from the troubles of this age. Herein is my life's savings, 200 gold sovereigns, and the best of my tools. I had hoped to use them to drain and tame this stubborn field, to build a home here for my son and his sons to come. But the world has other plans for me. If you are a Coulter, know that this is your birthright. If you are a stranger, I ask only that you use this gift not for idle folly, but to bring life back to this land. Do not let the stone defeat you. The stone is the bone of the house you will build. The soil is sour, but it can be sweetened. Work it well, and it will provide. May God grant you peace in this place. Sarah sank to her knees on the cold stone floor, the letter in one hand, the lantern in the other. The small, steady flame illuminated the neat stacks of coins, the waiting tools, and the words of an ancestor she had never known. The gold was a fortune, but it was the letter that was the true treasure. It was not just money. It was a mission, a blessing, and a continuation. Her father had not left her with a final insult. He had left her a map. The first practical matter was security. The open entrance to the vault was an invitation to any passer-by, and while the field was isolated, it was not invisible. Before she touched a single coin, Sarah slid the heavy limestone slab back into place as best she could, then disguised the edges with loose turf and stones. It was a temporary measure. She needed something permanent, something that spoke of ownership and defense. Her mind, now clear and focused, worked through the necessary steps with the methodical precision her grandfather had taught her. She walked back to Fenwick, no longer a destitute girl, but a woman with capital and a plan. Her first stop was not the draper or the baker, but the blacksmith's forge at the edge of the village. The smithy was a dark, cavernous space, ringing with the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel and smelling powerfully of coal smoke and hot iron. The blacksmith, a man in his 50s, with massive shoulders and a beard singed grey at the edges, was named Elias Vance. He stopped his work and looked at her, his eyes accustomed to judging the quality of metal at a glance. "What can I do for you, miss?" His voice was a low growl. Sarah did not pro-arrogate. "I need a heavy iron grate to cover a cellar opening," she said, her voice steady and a strong hasp and lock to secure it. "The opening is 40-6. She used a piece of charcoal from the forge floor to sketch the design on a slate slab, a hinged grate with bars thick enough to deter any casual thief and a plate for a heavy padlock. Mr. Vance looked at her sketch, then at her. He saw her worn dress and muddy boots, but he also saw the clarity in her eyes and the confidence in her voice. He saw the calluses on her hands. "That's a good deal of iron," he said, testing her. "It will not be cheap." "I expect to pay for good work," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze. She reached into her pocket and pulled out one of Jacob Coulter's sovereigns. The gold coin shone with a warm, buttery light in the gloom of the forge. Elias Vance's eyebrows rose a fraction. He picked up the coin, weighed it in his palm, and then looked at her with a new respect. "I can have it ready in 3 days," he said. "I'll need a lad to help me transport it. It will be heavy." "I will pay for the lad and the cart," Sarah said. He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. He was the first person in this new life to treat her as an equal, a customer with a legitimate purpose. And for that, she was quietly grateful. With the security of her inheritance arranged, she began the next phase of her plan. Establishing a life on the field itself, she used another sovereign to purchase a sturdy canvas tent, blankets, a cast-iron cooking pot, an axe, a good spade, and provisions to last a month. She was finished with sleeping in hollows in the rock. That night, she pitched her tent in the shelter of the northern corner, cooked a simple meal over a small, well-contained fire, and slept for the first time in her life on land that was truly her own. The 3 days while she waited for Elias Vance to forge the grate were not idle. They were spent beginning the immense task of clearing the field. She started in the corner where she planned to build her cottage, a spot that caught the morning sun and was most sheltered from the wind. The work was back-breaking. She used her new axe to chop down the tough woody gauze and the billhook from the vault to slash through the bracken. The roots were deep and tenacious, and she had to use her spade and all her strength to wrench them from the earth. Then came the stones. For every square foot of ground she cleared, she unearthed a dozen rocks from the size of her fist to the size of a loaf of bread. She did not curse them. As her grandfather had taught her, she saw them not as impediments, but as resources. Following his remembered instructions, she began to sort them, creating separate piles. The flat stratified pieces of sandstone were for paving and lentils. The blockier, more regular chunks were for walling. The small rounded river stones would be for drainage channels. It was a slow geological process, transforming a chaotic scattering into an orderly library of building materials. On the 3rd day, as promised, Mr. Vance arrived in a cart pulled by a shaggy pony, his son, a quiet boy of 16, holding the res. The iron grate was a magnificent piece of work, heavy and functional, its raw, dark metal a testament to the smith's skill. Together, the 3 of them managed to wrestle it into place over the stone opening. It fit perfectly. Mr. Vance set the hasp into the stone with iron pins and molten lead, the sharp smell of the hot metal filling the air. He handed her a heavy iron padlock and 2 keys. "No one will be getting through that without a great deal of noise and effort," he said, clipping his hands on a piece of sackcloth. Sarah paid him the agreed price, and as he was leaving, he paused. "You're planning on building?" he asked, gesturing to the neat piles of stone. "I am," she said. "A small cottage." He nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the field and the work she had already done. "You'll need a mason. Robert Peel is the best man for it. Lives by the church. Tell him Elias Vance sent you." It was a piece of advice, but it was also an endorsement, a quiet signal to the community that the strange young woman on Coulter's Folly was a person of substance. With the vault now secure, Sarah could begin to build her future. She sought out Robert Peel. I was an older man, thin and wiry, with stone dust settled into the deep lines of his face and the grey of his eyebrows. He listened to her plan without expression, his eyes assessing her the way they would assess a seam of rock. "I have no money for grand things," Sarah told him plainly, "but I have the stone, and I have the will to work. I don't want to just hire you. I want you to teach me. I will be your labourer, your hod carrier, your apprentice." Robert Peel was a man of few words. He walked with her back to the field and spent a long time examining her piles of sorted stone, picking up a piece here and there, testing its weight and grain. He looked at the foundation lines she had already marked out with string and pegs. He looked at her hands, which were now raw and blistered from her work. "The stone is good," he said at last, "and you sort it proper. I'll start on Monday. Be ready to learn. I don't suffer fools." The building of the cottage marked a new rhythm for Sarah's life. Every morning at dawn, Robert Peel would arrive and their work would begin. He was a demanding teacher, and she was a diligent student. He showed her how to mix lime mortar to the perfect consistency, how to read a stone to find its best face, how to lay the courses so they were strong and level. Sarah's days were filled with the heavy, repetitive labor of lifting and carrying stone. But her mind was alive with learning. She discovered the deep satisfaction of seeing a wall rise under her own hands, of creating order and permanence from the chaos of the field. The neat, strong corners of her cottage were a physical manifestation of her own growing competence. Her project did not go unnoticed in Fenwick. Soon another regular visitor appeared. Thomas Bell, a young carter with a kind face and a powerful chestnut May mare named Bess, began to make weekly trips from the market town, bringing the things she could not source from her own land. Timber for the roof beams, sacks of lime, and later panes of glass for the 2 small windows. He was quiet and shy, but he always had a word of encouragement for her, marveling at the progress she and Mr. Peel were making. "It's looking like a proper house now, Miss Coulter," he'd say, his admiration genuine. He began to time his deliveries for midday, and his mother would always pack an extra meat pasty or a wedge of apple cake in his bag, which he would share with Sarah and the old stonemason. These shared meals eaten sitting on the rising walls of the cottage were simple affairs, but they were the beginning of a community. The work forged a bond between the 3 of them that was stronger than any formal friendship. One afternoon, as they were struggling to lift a heavy stone lintel into place above the doorway, Elias Vance appeared walking down the track from the village. He had seen their struggle from the forge. Without a word, he added his immense strength to their efforts, and the stone slid smoothly into place. He stayed for an hour, helping them set the next course of stones before nodding a farewell and walking back to his fire. Word of her project and her industry spread through the village. She was no longer just the girl who had bought the useless field. She was becoming a known quantity, a part of the local landscape. The baker's wife, Mrs. Gable, a round, bustling woman, took to leaving a fresh loaf of bread on a flat stone by the track once a week. Sarah would leave a few pennies in its place, and this silent exchange became a small, comforting ritual. She was not just building a house. She was building a reputation, one stone at a time. The cottage was small, just a single large room with a wide hearth for cooking and warmth, and a small sleeping loft above. But it was hers. Every stone had been cleared by her, carried by her, and increasingly laid by her. As the roof timbers went up and the slates were laid, it transformed from a collection of walls into a true shelter, a home. By the time the first snows of winter dusted the high fells, the cottage was complete. The windows were glazed, the door was hung, and a steady plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Inside the fire in the hearth cast a warm, dancing light on the plaster walls which Sarah had applied and smoothed herself under Mr. Peel's critical eye. The furniture was simple and sparse. A sturdy table and 2 chairs made by the village carpenter, a bed in the loft with a straw-filled mattress and shelves for her few possessions. But it was more than enough. It was a haven of warmth and safety she had built with her own labor and Jacob Coulter's legacy. Her life settled into a new, deeply satisfying routine. The winter months were for indoor work and planning. She mended her clothes, read the book of pressed flowers her mother had left her, and using one of Jacob's old account books, she drew up careful plans for the spring. She laid out the rotation of crops, the placement of drainage ditches, and the design for a small barn she would build next. Using the last of the cleared stone, she was no longer just surviving. She was planning for a future, for abundance. As the land thawed in the spring, she began the second great phase of her project, bringing the field itself back to life. She hired Thomas Bell and his Bess not to haul stone, but to plough. The old hand plough from the vault was too slow for the whole field, and Bess's strength was needed to break the compacted earth. With the soil turned, Sarah walked the furrows, broadcasting lime to sweeten the acidity, followed by loads of manure from the village livery, which she paid for with another of her sovereigns. The field, which had for so long been a place of extraction, was now a place of nourishment. She was giving back to the land, healing it. The people of Fenwick now greeted her by name. "Morning, Sarah," they would call out as she walked to the village for supplies. Mrs. Gable would insist on giving her the warmest loaf from the oven. Mr. Vance would ask after the sturdiness of her grate. Robert Peel would stop by on his Sunday walks, inspecting her progress on the new stone walls she was building around a kitchen garden, offering a quiet word of approval. She had become Sarah Coulter of Coulter's Folly, but the name was no longer an insult. It was a title spoken with a mixture of curiosity and profound respect. She was the woman who had taken the worst piece of land in the parish and made it her own, who had turned stones into a home and barrenness into the promise of a harvest. Her solitude was no longer a sign of destitution, but of a quiet, unshakable self-reliance. One evening in early autumn, a year after her arrival, Sarah sat on the simple stone bench outside her cottage door. The day's work was done. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the wood's smoke from her chimney. Before her, the field was transformed. A thick green carpet of winter rye covered the acres she had cleared, ploughed and fed, the young shoots glowing in the soft light of the setting sun. The neat lines of her kitchen garden were heavy with the last of the season's bounty: cabbages, leeks, and hearty herbs. The once jumbled piles of stone had become the cottage, the garden walls, and a sturdy foundation for the small barn that now stood beside it. It was a landscape of order, purpose, and life. In her hands, she held the small wooden finch her mother had given her so long ago, its surface worn to a deep, smooth patina by years of anxious and comforting touch. On the bench beside her rested the billhook from Jacob Coulter's vault, its blade freshly sharpened and oiled, its handle fitting her own grip as if it were made for her. She thought of her stepmother, Agnes, in the fine house in the south, a house that now seemed to belong to another life entirely. Agnes had meant to cast her out into a barren wilderness, to give her a legacy of failure. But in her cold, calculated cruelty, she had given Sarah the greatest gift of all, a place where her own strength, her grandfather's wisdom, and an ancestor's hope could converge. She had been left with nothing but a field of stones, and from those stones she had built a foundation, a home, and a future. Sarah Coulter was 21 years old. She had a field that was no longer a folly, a home built by her own hands, and the respect of a community she had earned. It was the best inheritance a woman could ever ask for. There is a profound power in seeing the potential that others have overlooked, in finding wealth, not in what is easy, but in what can be reclaimed through patience and hard work. We hope Sarah's story has warmed your heart today. Please consider subscribing and sharing this story with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of a new beginning. And we'd love to hear from you. What is something in your own life that you or someone you know brought back to life when others had given up on